be your instructor for these lectures. Our topic today is drama. We will talk about the development of Renaissance drama from the early days to the times of Shakespeare. So we will talk about the early period in this lecture, and the next lecture we'll look at the time of Shakespeare and Shakespeare's theatre. So today we want to talk about Marlowe and the professional playwrights. They were called the professional playwright, the development of a type of playwrights who became professional, which means that they're not associated to the church or to the court, but they are theater companies that practice the theater to make a living. Yani they're professional. So this phenomena of professional playwrights, professional actors, appeared in the early modern period, in the Renaissance period, and then developed to become the professional business that it has become in the time of Shakespeare. So the first English plays, we have to understand that the first English plays were religious plays. There was no such thing as secular drama or secular plays. All the plays that were performed were religious. They told religious stories, and they tried to teach the population religious ideas and religious values. They were performed in the church or near the church, and it was the church's, in a way, organ of propaganda to the people. That's how the church propagated, its ideas to the population through these religious plays. These plays, these early plays, were called miracle plays or mystery plays. Miracle plays or mystery plays. They were also called morality plays, right? Morality plays because they tell the population morals. They teach them morality. And they were miracle or mystery plays because they told the population about the miracles and the mysteries of Christianity. The subject of miracle plays, for example, miracle plays, they were various. They included topics and subjects like Adam and Eve, right? Like Noah and the great ark, the great flood, yani Sayyidina Nuh and the great flood. The morality plays were different from miracle plays. The difference between them is that morality plays had characters that were not people. The characters in morality plays يعني بيكونوا abstract values. Like, for example, you say al-khair or shar. They would be characters like good and evil. Good would be a character and evil would be a character. Like mercy would be a character, right? So the characters were not people in morality plays. They were abstract values. And that was the Christian church's way of propagating its values through these miracle plays. Religious plays, the religious plays contained comic and mundane, yani everyday life subjects, and they provided these comic and mundane interludes, and these were provided with demonic and grotesque figures behaving in a buffoonish manner. Yani the values that the church wanted people to stay away from, they would present them in a buffoonish and grotesque manner, to tell people, hey, look, you shouldn't be like these people. You shouldn't have these values. These are the good values you should have. But it was also presented in a comic and buffoonish way, and it was a way of letting people يعني يتسلوا شوية. It was a way of letting people let off steam, as they say, you know, and enjoying themselves and having a laugh, right? So they taught them their propaganda, but at the same time they allowed them a small window بينفسوا على نفسهم فيه through laughter, through comedy, and so on and so forth. There is some connection between these characters who run clowning among the audience. From this culture, the English Renaissance and modern and the English theatre emerged. This is the source. This is where English Renaissance theatre will develop. Comedy was better than tragedy. Comedy was more sophisticated and showed a lot more creativity than tragedy. And there were many playwrights that appeared in this early period. But out of all those early playwrights, Christopher Marlowe really outshined all the rest of them. So the first generation of professional playwrights, this new generation of professional playwrights, they're not connected to the church now. They're not connected to, they're independent from the church. Their topics and subject matters are not religious propaganda anymore. Now they have topics that entertain and instruct. They have some instruction in them. They want to teach people about various topics, about politics, about law, about responsibility, about, marriage, about gender relations, all sorts of topics that are of interest to the population, to an educated public, because now there is an educated public in Europe that needs entertainment and instruction. So the first generation of these professional playwrights in England became known collectively as the university wits. The university wits, wits. They were, witty with words. They were like wordsmiths. They knew how to use words to tell stories. And they were connected to the universities of Oxford and Cambridge, which were new universities at the time. So they were known as the university wits. Their nickname identifies their social position. They come from the university, they're educated, they're upper middle class people. But their dramas, they were primarily middle class, patriotic, and romantic. So love and romance were central in their dramas. The patriotism, England and the glory of England and the empire of England was very important. And they were middle class in the sense that they respected the social norms and the social regulations of the middle classes. You don't find bad words in it, you don't find bad manners. They respected the laws of decorum, the cultural codes of the middle classes in that sense. They preferred subjects that were historical or semi-historical, right? And they mixed them with clowning, music, or a love interest. But mostly their subject matter was either historical or semi-historical. Marlowe wrote many great sophisticated plays. For instance, in Tamburlaine the Great, which was a play written in 2 parts and it was published in 1590, or for example Edward II, in 1591 performed and published in 1594. Notice that plays were written to be performed first, and it's only later on that they get published. But in these plays, in Tamburlaine the Great and Edward II, traditional political orders are overwhelmed by conquerors and politicians who ignore the boasted legitimacy of we kings. What happens is that there is kings that are overwhelmed by conquerors that come to England to conquer England, and the existing political order is overwhelmed. It presents a situation in which people feel that their political order is not stable, they're not strong, and there is a need to argue the case for like stronger states and stronger kings and stronger nation and so on. In his play, The Jew of Malta, which was written in 1589 and published in 1633, notice the gap between the time of writing in 1589 and the publication in 1633, and تقريبا 43 years after it was written, the play was published. So The Jew of Malta studies the man of business, the businessman in Renaissance England. And this businessman was a lot of the time Jewish. So it's called The Jew of Malta. And it studied the businessman whose financial sharpness of mind and trickery give him unrestrained power. So he becomes like powerful by controlling the finances of the society. Of course, there is a certain amount of anti-Semitism in these plays, and it's reflected in the way the Jews were treated in England at the time. They were maligned and, of course, prevented from settling in England or owning land or so on. For example, also Marlowe wrote The Tragical History of Dr. Faustus, which is probably his most famous, The Tragical History of Dr. Faustus, written in 1593 and published in 1604. And this play depicts the overthrow of a man whose learning shows little regard for his own religion, for his own Christianity. The main focus of all these plays is the uselessness of society's moral sanctions, yani the medieval spirit, the medieval moral system becomes useless in the face of the pragmatism and the amoral will that's emerging in the Renaissance. The Renaissance is bringing a culture that's about business, that's about progress, that's about making money, that's about conquering other nations and other lands, and doesn't want to be limited by the moral worldview of the Middle Ages. And here we have a clash between the medieval moral Christian worldview and the developing economic and ideological ideas that are developing in the Renaissance. These plays clearly address themselves to the anxieties of an age. These are the fears and the anxieties of the age that's being transformed by new forces in politics, in commerce, in science, as we saw in the first lectures when we talked about the economic and political transformations that happened in Europe during the Renaissance. So these economic and political transformations are shown in the literature of the time. The anxieties, the fears, the conflicts, and so on. Indeed, the sinister, ironic prologue to The Jew of Malta is spoken by Machiavelli, the famous Italian author who famously wrote the book The Prince, which is a book that shows a very cold, calculating, opportunistic approach to politics, and it reflected the spirit of the Renaissance. In his own time, Marlowe was damned because his plays remained disturbing. Marlowe's plays were disturbing to his societies because his verse and his plays turns theatre into the expression of power, enlisting the spectators' sympathies on the side of his gigantic villain heroes. So he presented these gigantic villain heroes, and he solicited the sympathy of the audience for these villains, right? By presenting these villains somehow from certain perspective to be human. And his plays thus present the spectator with dilemmas. that can be neither resolved nor ignored. So they cannot resolve them because they are big dilemmas. And they can't ignore them because these are the dilemmas of their age. These are the dilemmas that are in their everyday life, in their economic life, in their political life, and so on. And they articulated exactly the divided consciousness of their time, conflict between the medieval and the Renaissance values. There is a similar effect we find it in the play called, the famous play, The Spanish Tragedy, which was written in 1591 by Marlowe's friend Thomas Kyd. This is an early revenge tragedy, it's called a revenge tragedy, in which the hero seeks justice for the loss of his son. His son is killed and he seeks justice in an unjust world. He can achieve this justice only by taking the law into his own hands. Thomas Kyds's play uses extensively Senecan conventions, the conventions that were elaborated in the Roman period by Roman playwrights like Seneca. Notably, a ghost impatient for revenge, for example, this is a Senecan convention. And he uses these in a Christian setting and expresses a genuine conflict of values, making the hero's success at once triumphant and horrifying. Dr. Faustus represents this conflict par excellence. So the best text or play that tells us about this conflict is really Dr. Faustus by Christopher Marlowe. Dr. Faustus in the play is a well-respected German scholar. He grows dissatisfied with the limits of traditional forms of knowledge, with logic, with medicine, with law, and religion, of course. And he decides that he wants to learn to practice magic. Khalas, he doesn't want to study, these topics anymore. He wants to learn magic. His friends, Valdez and Cornelius, instruct him in the black arts of magic. And he begins his new career as a magician by summoning up, by calling Mephistopheles, who is the devil. The devil in the Christian tradition is called Mephistopheles. So he calls the devil, they show him how to use magic, and he uses those skills to call the devil. Despite Mephistopheles' warning about the horrors of hell, so the devil, Shaitan, he warns him about the horrors of hell. But Faustus tells the devil to return to his master, Lucifer, Shaitan, right, with an offer of Faustus' soul in exchange for 24 years of service from Mephistopheles. Yani Faustus wants a bargain, right, a deal. He wants Mephistopheles to work for him for 24 years, and in exchange, Dr. Faustus would give his soul after these 24 years to the devil. Meanwhile, Wagner, Faustus' servant, has picked up some magical abilities and uses it to press a clown named Robin into his service. This reflects the culture of magic and superstition that was so common in the Renaissance. It's interesting that we think that the Renaissance was simply about science and great inventions and mathematics and creativity and so on. But really the Renaissance was also a culture that was full of superstitions and magic. And you can see this clearly in these early plays where you find the culture of magic and superstition coexisting with a cold and calculating spirit of progress and political achievements and economic wealth and so on. So Mephistopheles returns to Faustus with word that Lucifer, the devil, has accepted his offer. Faustus experiences some misgivings. He starts, saying, well, maybe I shouldn't do it. And he wonders if he should spend and repent and save his soul. In the end, he agrees to sign the contract with his blood, with his own blood. As soon as he signed the contract, the words humo fuge, which means in Latin, "O man, fly." So as soon as he signed the contract with his own blood, these words, "O man, fly," appear branded on his arm. Faustus again has second thoughts, right? But Mephistopheles gives him rich gifts and a book of spells to learn from. Later, Mephistopheles answers all of his questions about the nature of the world, refusing to answer only when Faustus asks him who made the universe. The refusal prompts yet another round of misgivings in Faustus. Faustus is in doubt. Should I go along with this deal? Should I stay away? So he feels like maybe I shouldn't be doing this. But Mephistopheles and Lucifer bring in personifications of the 7 deadly sins. The 7 deadly sins come personified as people to convince Faustus, and he is impressed enough to quiet his doubts, and he goes ahead with the deal. So, armed with these new powers and attended by Mephistopheles, Faustus begins to travel. He goes to the Pope's court in Rome, makes himself invisible. He has all these great new capabilities. He can become invisible. He can visit the Pope in Rome. And he plays a series of tricks on people. And he disrupts the Pope's banquets, and the Pope was having a big party, a banquet, and he managed to disrupt it by stealing food and boxing the Pope's ears. Following, and you notice also because Marlowe comes from a Protestant culture in England, so he has no problem satirizing and showing the Pope, the Catholic Pope, in comical incidents like these, and showing him being beaten and so on. So following this incident, he travels through the courts of Europe, from the royal courts, with his fame spreading as he goes. So he becomes very famous. Eventually he is invited to the court of the German Emperor Charles V, the enemy of the Pope, and he asks Faustus to allow him to see Alexander the Great, the famed 4th century BC Macedonian king and conqueror. Faustus conjures up an image of Alexander, and Charles is suitably impressed. A knight makes fun of Faustus's powers, and Faustus punishes him by making antlers, bony horns basically, appear on his head. Furious, the knight vows revenge. Meanwhile, Robin, Wagner's own clown, has picked up some magic on his own, and with his fellow Rafe, he starts a number of comic adventures. At one point, he manages to summon Mephistopheles, who a command he calls Mephistopheles, who threatens to turn Robin and Rafe into animals, or perhaps even does transform them. The text isn't clear, to punish them for their foolishness. Faustus then goes on with his travels, playing a trick on a horse courser along the way. Faustus sells him a horse that turns into a heap of straw when ridden into a river. Eventually, Faustus is invited to the court of the Duke of Vanholt, where he performs various tricks. The horse courser shows up there along with Robin, a man named Dick, Rafe in the text, and various others who have fallen victim to Faustus's trickery. But Faustus casts spells on them and sends them on their way, to the amusement of the Duke and the Duchess. As the 24 years of his deal with Lucifer come to a close, so that's it, his 24-year deal is coming to an end. Now he has to pay Lucifer, he has to pay the devil. Faustus begins to dread his approaching death, right? He has Mephistopheles call up Helen of Troy, the famous beauty from the ancient world, the lady on whose behalf the war of Troy happened in ancient Greece. So he makes Mephistopheles calls Helen of Troy and uses her presence to impress a group of scholars. An old man urges Faustus to repent, but Faustus drives him away. Faustus summons Helen again and expresses great admiration for her exceptional beauty, but time is growing short. Faustus tells the scholars about his pact, and they are horror-stricken. They feel horrible. They think this is a terrible thing that he has done. And they resolve to pray for him. On the final night, before the expiration of the 24 years, Faustus is overcome by fear and remorse. He begs for mercy, but it is too late. At midnight, a group of devils appear and carries his soul off to hell. In the morning, the scholars find Faustus's limbs, the parts of his bodies, and decide to hold a funeral for him. This play essentially is about how Faustus puts on a performance for the Emperor and Duke of Vanholt. The main thesis of the play is a climax and the climax is when Faustus' two friends, Valdes and Cornelius, who are magicians themselves, teach him how to do magic. Faustus uses this magic to summon up the devil, and the devil's name is Mephistopheles, and Faustus signs over his soul to Lucifer, Satan, in return to keep Mephistopheles for 24 years. So all these adventures happen in the space of 24 years. Faustus is not a professor anymore, he's not an academic anymore, he's not a scientist, he is now a magician. He has great powers, he can travel across Europe, he can create miracles, he can jump from one court to another, he's famous and so on, but he can become invisible if he wants. But at the same time, time is running away, and the 24 years is coming to an end, and now he has to pay his debt to the devil. He has to give his soul to the devil. And by the end of the 24 years, Faustus, he had a great fun. He enjoyed himself. He did all the things he wanted. But he feels that the price he is about to pay is still huge. And he starts feeling scared and terrified and tries to repent, right? Yitub, but it's too late. And, a group of devils come and take him away to hell. This, more or less, is the topic of the subject of Dr. Faustus, the famous play by Christopher Marlowe. There is some important points here that we need to retain. Mundane drama, it's drama about everyday life, as opposed to the dramas before that were religious and about important religious issues. This is mundane drama. It grew out of the restrictions on religious drama in the late 16th century and contributed to the emergence of the English theatre. The professional stage, it's the late 16th century, saw the establishment of the first permanent theatres and the professionalization of the English theatre world. This is the time when theatres were built, stages, there is theatre houses. This is the first ones built in England, and the first time also that professional theatre companies are formed and they travel around the country performing plays and entertaining the population. Acting companies is a reference to companies. They were all males, there were no women, there were no females in the acting companies. The women were not allowed to act publicly, and acting companies were generally of two kinds. There was adult acting companies and boy acting companies. Playwriting is also a term that develops in this period. There was a massive expansion in the number of plays in English in the late 16th century. Huge number of plays were written in the late 16th century in English. Many were written collaboratively, yani more than one playwright participates, 2 or 3 of them. They drew on a variety of sources. For example, they used classical and medieval dramatic traditions and used motives and topics and ideas from them. The regulations, all plays had to be licensed for performance. You can't just come and perform a play. You need a government license to perform a play. And for printing, and there was also a limit on how many copies you can print. Some were subject to censorship, of course. Some plays were prevented from publication because the government felt that the topic or the subject was too sensitive. And generally because they dealt directly with living individuals or contentious issues. Publication. Plays were generally written for performance, not for publication. Publication only took place years later, sometimes 5, 10, or even 30 years later. But plays were written specifically for performance, not for reading. Only some were printed. Printed versions of plays were not necessarily the same as each other or as the versions that were originally performed in the theater. So the plays that were performed were not necessarily the same text that was published later. So for example, with Shakespeare, we don't know if the text that was printed and published is the one that Shakespeare used in his performances. Staging Renaissance plays had to be adaptable for a variety of venues and stages. They weren't sophisticated theaters. They didn't have lighting and design and stuff. So you had to write plays that could be performed in a variety of simple stages and theaters, and therefore generally relied on a minimalist staging style. Scenery and sets were not used. Settings were usually evoked through textual allusions. Yani if they say we're in Rome, they couldn't like build Rome there. They would just like suggest to the audience through the dialogue that we are in Rome. Academic drama, it was common to study and perform classical plays in schools and at the universities as a way of training students in Latin, rhetoric, and oratory. Inns of court drama, these were lawyers, for example, occasionally hosted professional performances and mounted their own plays and masks. Their own entertainments were often politically topical in theme and satirical in mode. Court drama, this is in the royal courts, dramatic entertainments were a central part of court culture, as well as hosting play and mask performances. Monarchs were accustomed to being entertained with short shows when they went around the country. These often combined advice or request for patronage. The household or closet drama, these were noblemen, rich people and women who sometimes patronized and played host to professional players. They would bring them into their mansions or their homes and fund them and pay them so they would play for them privately and for their wealthy friends. Some also staged amateur performances and all wrote their own plays and masks. Some of these texts are closet drama intended for reading. Others appear to have been written for performances. As far as the attitudes to drama, the large audiences drawn to players' performances point to a popular taste for public theatre. Yani there were large crowds coming to watch these plays in London and the rest of England. And this indicates that there was a popular taste, that people in general, not just wealthy people or the king or the princes and stuff who enjoyed drama, but even the average people did. But the stage had its opponents. There were people who opposed the stage and denounced the plays and so on. Some complained that plays were morally corrupting. They were corrupting the morals of people. Others were concerned that theatres were causes for crime, disease and disorder. Opponents of the theatre were often characterized as Puritans, but not all Puritans were opponents of drama and vice versa. Comedy, small word about comedy. Comedies dominated the professional stage in the late 16th century. They were defined by their happy endings rather than their use of humor, and borrowed from classical and European comical writing. Tragedies were slightly different. The first English tragedies were written in the Renaissance and were influenced by Senecan tragedy and medieval tales. Tragedy only became one of the dominant genres in the Jacobean period later on. History plays dramatized the stories of reputedly historical characters. Yani some historical characters were written in chronicles, for example, and history plays would present those subjects in tragedies and events, and were particularly fashionable in the 1590s. Many were based on material found in the wave of historical chronicles. There was a lot of historical writing. Historical chronicles were being written at the time. And a lot of this historical material that was written in these chronicles would find itself the subject of tragedies. Romance and tragicomedy. Early Elizabethan plays often mixed tragedy and comedy. They mixed the two. In the early 17th century, there was a renewed taste for plays which mixed the genre, including romances and tragic comedies. Some contemporaries complained about such generic hybrid. Some of them were against this hybridization of genre where people mix comedy and tragedy. But tragicomedy became the dominant dramatic genre on the Stuart stage. Masks, something that's very famous. They call them masks. They're essentially was a lavish multimedia form of entertainment developed in the Renaissance and particularly popular at the Stuart court. The proscenium arch from the front of the stage, perspective staging and female performance were pioneered in England in court masks. They were essentially like forms of dramas, but they were more on like not open to the public, but more like masks that happen and take place among wealthy people. And this brings us to the end of this lecture. Thank you so much for listening. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.